Welcome to Authors at Drucker. I'm Dave Specht, Director of the Global Family Business Institute at the Drucker School of Management. At the Drucker School, we aspire to become the global meeting place for the world's most influential business-owning families. And today's conversation represents progress in our achievement of that objective. Authors at Drucker is an interview series where we feature top authors that write about issues impacting business-owning families. Authors at Drucker is made possible from the generous sponsorship from the James E. Hughes Jr. Foundation. The foundation is dedicated to the advancing of the study of family governance and generational well-being. We at the Drucker School feel very aligned and very grateful to Jay and his foundation. On the last Authors at Drucker, we featured a book called Hug of War, How to Lead a Family Business with Both Love and Logic, and that was by Kathy Carroll. If you missed it, please feel free to check out the recording on YouTube or on our website. Before we begin, I wanted to mention two initiatives going on at the Drucker School that I'm really excited about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. The first one is our certificate program in advising family enterprises. We are currently scheduling for the fall and for the winter with institutions that want their advisors to be better and be able to facilitate conversations and planning at the intersection of the financial and non-financial lives of these families that own businesses. And so if you or your organization is interested in hosting a cohort, please feel free to reach out to me at david.specht@cgu.edu. And the next one is our Generational Wealth Masterclass. This is content that Jay Hughes and I recorded some time ago. And again, if you're interested in learning more or being a part of a cohort to go through this masterclass, feel free to reach out to me. And finally, on to the star of the show here. Today's guest is Jennifer Wines. Jennifer has worked at some of the top private wealth management firms in the world, Goldman Sachs, JPMorgan, and Fidelity, just to name a few. She's earned a law degree from Suffolk University in Boston and is a certified wealth advisor, and she received that designation from the Booth School of Business. Jennifer is the author of Invisible Wealth, 5 Principles of Redefining Personal Wealth in a New Paradigm. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us on Authors at Drucker.
Thank you, Dave, for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here and very much looking forward to our talk today for the next 45 minutes, hour or so.
So I've enjoyed spending time in Invisible Wealth, and I love the title, and maybe we can start off. It's always interesting to go behind the scenes with an author and figure out, like, how did you land there? Why Invisible Wealth, and what does it really mean?
That's a great question. And this is a question naturally I get a lot because the book title certainly invites the question, what is invisible wealth? And I don't have that one silver bullet moment, but I know that when it came to mind, I was like, yes, this is it. And everything else just cascaded. And again, so to answer the question, what is invisible wealth? I'm going to answer this from a 30,000-foot view before landing at the answer. And I want to take a really kind of a scenic route to get to the answer, Dave, because I think it'll be really productive for the rest of our conversation. And so bear with me as I journey through kind of what is invisible wealth. And I'm going to take a first principles approach to this question, meaning that I'm going to break it down into its most fundamental parts by addressing first what is wealth before getting to what is invisible wealth. Okay. So first things first, what is wealth, right? This is a great age-old question. And if we take a look back, we'll see that the word wealth came into our lexicon in the mid-13th century from England, which you were just there. And it came from the root well, W-E-L-E. And so that meant health and well-being. So wealth found its definitional roots in health and well-being and embodied this essence of health, well-being, and happiness. But over time, wealth became synonymous with an abundance of money and material possessions. And there are evolutionary reasons for this, right? Due to the increased sophistication of money and the increased sophistication of economies over time. So over time, as economies evolved and money evolved, so too did our concept and definition of wealth, with money and wealth nearly collapsing into meaning one and the same. And here's the thing, the meaning of words can evolve over time. And in fact, there's a word for that, and it's called etymology. And etymology is a study of words and how the meaning of words can change over time. Over time, words have a way of wandering. They can find their way onto different pastures, meaning that meanings can mutate, and the meaning of a word can become more expansive over time, more narrow over time, or change in meaning entirely. It really depends upon what's going on within its environment. Because words, like people, are often a product of their environment. And this is exactly why I believe it's time for us to revisit and redefine wealth with consideration for the technological advancements and societal shifts that are underway. Because these advancements and shifts are propelling us into this new wealth paradigm, a paradigm that's providing us with an incredibly unique opportunity to revisit what we value. And when we revisit value, we inherently revisit wealth because we're wealthy when we have an abundance of what we value. So the question then becomes, what are we valuing and why? And these days, we're valuing the intangibles of life more so than the tangibles. And I mean that both practically and philosophically.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll say to you, Dave, like perhaps you or the audience might be thinking to yourself, well, why are we talking about redefining wealth literally? To which I always like to answer, because one's definition of wealth defines the richness of their life, right? An antiquated, narrow definition of a word is going to lead to an antiquated, narrow application of the word. Whereas a modern and expansive definition of a word is going to lead to a modern and expansive application of the word. And while I'm not suggesting that each word take on this expansive definition, there are certain words that command it, and wealth is one of those words. So invisible wealth is an invitation for us to think about wealth as money and other assets, right? Other assets which are increasingly or inherently intangible.
Yeah, I like it. One of the things I think, as I think about money, I think of money as a magnifier. And Jay Hughes talks a lot about this as well. And I think that in your 5 principles, you really kind of bring that out as if you just look at money and if we're just pursuing money, I think all of us maybe have fallen into that trap at a certain point in our life, and we realize that, no amount is really going to fulfill our life. We need enough, but ultimately, money and the financial capital should be it should be in service of these other capitals. So maybe you can maybe that's a good bridge to talking about what are your 5 principles of invisible wealth?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I agree with you in terms of money being an amplifier and that there's so much more to wealth than money. And that's exactly what the 5 principles of invisible wealth represent, right? It's a framework for the big abstract concept of invisible wealth. It invites us to think about wealth in a more holistic way, right? In a more comprehensive way. And each of the principles present a group of assets that we go through life wanting to attain more of, albeit perhaps at different points and times in our lives. So the first one is money and investment, naturally. The second is health and quality of life. The third is knowledge, status, and influence. The fourth is time, energy, and experiences. And the fifth is relationship with self and others. And one thing that I want to point out here is that the antiquated, narrow definition of wealth only takes into consideration the first principle, money, right? Whereas the modern and expansive interpretation of wealth takes into consideration all 5 of these principles, right? All of these assets, essentially a prism of assets. So those are the 5 principles that kind of represent the infrastructure for the concept of invisible wealth.
Very good. I think we should dig into each one. I really appreciated kind of the historical narrative that you provided around the context of money and its evolution. So from commodity to representative to fiat to electronic and digital. How has the form of money influenced how we interact with it and treat it? I don't know if that question even makes sense, but how does the form of money impact how we interact with it?
It makes so much sense, and I'm glad you asked it. It's a fascinating question. So as we saw when we just walked through the 5 principles, right? The first one is money and investment. And while I do suggest a more expansive interpretation of wealth, there's no denying that money is a necessity of life, right? I don't want to negate its value, but it makes, that said, I want to make sure that we address like what is money, and that's why I did so in the book. And staying on brand or staying on theme with the intangible kind of invisible essence, I wanted to provide the historical context of money because we're becoming increasingly comfortable with pegging value to intangible assets, practically speaking, and money is a use case for that. So as you may have known, or as you know from the book, we used to use cowrie shells as money, like the little seashells.
Yep.
And then we traversed to gold coins, and then to dollar bills or representative money. And now we're firmly rooted in the era of electronic money, and we're traversing into the arena of digital money. And this is really fascinating and highlights the fact that, again, we're placing value and pegging value to things that we can't hold in our hands. For me, I think that's utterly fascinating. In fact, today, there's only 10% of the money supply. Yes, 10% of the money supply is in physical, tangible form, which is a staggering number. And one thing I want to point out here, because it's a distinction worth unpacking, is the distinction between electronic money and digital money. Electronic money can take physical, tangible form, whereas electronic money never takes on physical, tangible form. And so the way that we're interfacing with money, to get more directly to your point in terms of how we interact with it, well, history and logic tells us that from gold coins to electronic money, for example, makes for much more efficient and expansive economies. And the intangible nature of this electronic and digital money enhances the functional attributes of money, which is, it functions as a store of value, unit of account, and medium of exchange. Mm-hmm. So we can understand why there's been wide adoption, wide proliferation of the use of electronic money, and now we're traversing into digital money. So now we just take our phone, right, and we go up to a kiosk and we purchase something just like this. Yeah. We do a few strokes on the computer, and PayPal wallet is connected to something that we're purchasing on, insert favorite website there. But yeah, the way that we interface with money is vastly different from times past. And I think it's worth highlighting and noting because everything has just happened so quickly. And it's quite a powerful transformation.
For sure. I was just traveling in Europe, and, physical money almost doesn't have, it almost has no value because you can't move about the cities without, without the electronic. And, one thing that I don't think is kept up is the way that we educate the rising generation about their interactions with money. I personally worry about this. I told you earlier, I have 6 kids. So for me, when I had physical dollars, or when my older children had physical dollars and they wanted to go buy something, there was a little bit of pain involved when they gave the dollars away and received something in exchange. With the way that we're headed, I wonder if that kind of, I don't know if pain is the right word, but if there's it maybe feels like nothing is actually lost in the transaction. And I don't know if that psychologically is good for us or not. I don't know if you've thought about that.
It's a really good point. And I do think there's something to be said about when you hand over $10 and you get $2 back, you really see that reflection of the value extraction, right? Or exchange in a tangible, physical way. My hope is that this next generation, they're so used to digital that it kind of negates the power of passing over a $10 bill, sort of how it was meaningful for us, perhaps.
Yeah, it's going to be different. It's just going to be different. Yeah.
But I agree with you. I mean, I think education on finances all around is really lacking, unfortunately, despite all the effort that goes towards it. It's fascinating because perhaps it's a thing that needs to be taught on a daily basis, while someone's buying a water at the grocery store, and teachers don't follow kids around and parents are busy. So
yeah. In the book, you talk about millennials as the unluckiest generation. I'm not sure they like that. I'm not sure they like that tag or whatever, but it is what it is. How do they get that descriptor attached to them, and what do you think the future looks like for them now?
Yeah. So speaking of kids, right, and the value of money. So millennials are called many things. The unluckiest generation being one of them, also the title of the second chapter in my book. And I know from experience why they're called the unluckiest generation, because I am one. And I also know from research, millennials are actually the most researched cohort that there is to date. So that was fascinating to learn. But there are three primary hallmarks of why millennials are the unluckiest generation. And again, I know all three firsthand, but the first was coming of professional age during the Great Recession, so in 2008. And I vividly remember I graduated law school in 2010 and was met with lackluster employment opportunities, as were all my fellow millennial friends. And I graduated law school 2010. It was literally the worst year on record to graduate law school. So I nailed that one. That was great. And then
Congratulations.
thanks. I should have gotten a diploma for that.
Yeah, exactly.
And then speaking of school and diplomas, millennials amassed a large amount of student loan debt. And so when I graduated law school, I walked out with a diploma as well as debt. And so I left and I graduated with 6 figures of student loan debt. And it wasn't just me, of course, it was 40% of the millennial experienced the same thing.
Yeah.
And so then the third hallmark of millennials being the unluckiest generation is the fact that we started adulthood and the home prices were like this.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the ability to get financing was like this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's problematic, right? When you want to get a home and you have lackluster employment options and you're saddled with student loan debt. So millennials came into adulthood at a financial deficit from nearly every which angle. They came into adulthood, in the worst economic odds of any other generation thus far, hence the unluckiest generation. But I do think necessity is the mother of all invention. And the millennial generation is diverse, it's well educated, and we face uncharted territories. And with that, we're required to kind of adopt this creative adaptability. And this skill set, this creative adaptability, I think is now incredibly in vogue within the workforce and then just in life more broadly speaking, because of the velocity of change that's underway. So I see that as the silver lining for the experiences that the millennials went through.
Well, I mean, take home ownership, for instance, because it was basically not possible for many of the millennials as soon as they graduated. I feel like millennials accepted that maybe they would not own a home, and then it shifted even more to, well, maybe home ownership isn't like the thing that we should be necessarily pursuing. I think it was an interesting time where things that were assumed were brought into question. Like, well, is that what we really want? Is that what I'm really supposed to do? You look at millennials are getting married later, and I'm sure that had something to do with the financial situation as well. And so it's yeah, their experience was unique, and so it's going to create a different mindset around their relationship with money, their relationship with debt, home ownership, all kinds of other things that you mentioned in the book.
Yeah.
I want to touch on, so you talk about the 5 principles, which is a novel way of kind of expanding the current perception of wealth or financial capital. And you talk about the relationship with money, investment, and wealth. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the different relationship that people have with earned money versus inherited money. Before you answer that, I feel like there's a real problem with advisors now, and that there's very little empathy. I feel like there's an empathy crisis in the advice space, and it has everything to do with inherited versus earned money. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on inherited versus earned.
That's really fascinating, and I'd love your thoughts a little bit more on that, to unpack that after I share my thoughts. So I love the question. And whenever this topic comes into the mix, right, in conversations, I often think about client scenarios or stories about those who have earned wealth versus those who have inherited wealth. But I'd like to explore here is a bit of a conceptual wrapper instead of diving into various stories. And this conceptual wrapper may be a little bit avant-garde perhaps, but again, Dave, I'd love your thoughts after I share where I'm going. So I think as humans, we're all wired to create, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these creative energies manifest in different ways for different people. Some people might opt to create money. Some people might opt to create art. Some people might opt to create families. Hopefully one family, but you get where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
And creation is the act of originating or producing or inventing something that arguably wouldn't exist if Dave, for example, didn't deploy his efforts to that, your determination, your exertion, your labor. And the inspiration that fuels that creation is going to be specific to the individual or specific to you. So there's cohesion between the created and the creator,
Mm-hmm.
and whether that's creation or money or otherwise, right? So where things start to get interesting, as we know, is when an individual inherits money from somebody else. The cohesion between the wealth and the inheritor has the potential to become a little bit distorted, right? Not always, but often, or to differing degrees.
The relationship is always different. I don't know why we assume it should be the same. I think it's a bad assumption.
I absolutely agree with you. And that's the thing, it's a matter of degree, right? Because, and again, if you don't create something yourself with your own determination and inspiration, there's an inherent disconnect from that creation naturally, and to varying degrees again. And so if we consider like a hypothetical example of a father who amasses immense wealth through his real estate business, right?
Mm-hmm.
He has two sons, and the two sons are going to inherit all the money upon the father's demise. You know, the first son, Jack, would go to the office and watch dad create all this wealth, and he felt he was a part of it, and he was filling up the water bubbler, and, you know, he was on the ground listening to all the things about real estate. Perhaps he felt some connection, right, to the creation of that wealth. The relationship is going to be different than, say, son number two, let's call him Mark, which really didn't take any interest, doesn't really take after dad in terms of interest and determination. And he instead wanted to go to school, or spend his summers rather, in coding camp. And that's exactly what he did. Therefore, Mark's a little bit perhaps detached from the wealth creation just because he wasn't on the ground while it was happening. And again,
Yeah.
perhaps with an asterisk, maybe
Yep.
two. We're always playing in shades of gray here in terms of how different family members feel about wealth. But that's where the real magic comes in. And I would love your thoughts on this, because the real magic comes in the ability to build cohesion, the ability to build the bridge between the wealth that's created and the inheritor. And that's really meaningful work. And then one final point I'll say here too is that I think there's an increasing interest for the next gen specifically about making money with values in mind, spending money with values in mind, and investing money with values in mind. And
Yeah.
ultimately, as a collective, we're all kind of searching for this higher octave relationship with wealth, right? We're hearing phrases like money and meaning, purpose and profit, these types of things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's becoming a little bit more commonplace to talk about the essence or creation of money and what fueled that in a meaningfully way. Where does your mind go?
Well, with certain families that I've worked with, the money becomes a burden because many of the rising generation want to pursue their creation journey. And if there's a need to steward all of these assets of of the senior generation, then it can feel more like a burden than a blessing,
Yeah.
because it can take away their time, their attention from chasing down their own dreams. And that's where I think there's a huge lack of empathy with the advisor community. There's all kinds of jokes of, yeah, well, I'd switch your problems and try how that feels for a while. There's just very little empathy for it. So I think cohesion is the right word. I think we need to have more conversation around the stuff and what happens with it, because Jay Hughes and I had a conversation about this, about the shared dream fallacy, and the fact that millions and millions of people went to sleep last night, and we probably all had dreams. Some we remembered, some we woke up and told someone about, and some we even maybe acted on. But the fact is that no one has the same dream. And so I think there just needs to be more conversation, especially with families of means, as to, how are we going to steward this? How do you want to be in a relationship with it? How do you want this to influence your life or not? And again, that's an individual conversation. I can think of my own 6 kids, and they would all probably have a different relationship with whatever, I was passionate about and that I created over my career. And so I shouldn't assume that they're going to want to be in the same relationship with whatever I created. Um, yeah, it's fascinating. Definitely deserves a lot of our attention to talk about it, and then make plans. And no two families is going to do it the same way. So that's what makes this really interesting work.
I
Um,
absolutely.
I, okay. I wanted to talk about another form of wealth. You talk about knowledge, status, and influence. Tell us why you feel this is a measure of wealth, and how should we think about investing in it?
Mm. So I'll start high level and I'll get more directly to your question. So at the beginning of the conversation, we talked about how invisible wealth is a concept for redefining wealth, right? It's an invitation for us to revisit and redefine what wealth means from the antiquated narrow definition of wealth is an abundance of money to a modern and expansive definition of wealth is when you have an abundance of what you value, right? And further, the things that we value are called assets. So that's the concept. Let's place that over here. Now, if we pivot on over to the 5 principles of invisible wealth, which is the framework that we chatted about at the beginning as well, each principle presents a group of assets that we go through life wanting to attain more of, albeit perhaps at different points in times in our lives, right? This framework invites a more multidimensional interpretation of wealth instead of the one-dimensional interpretation of wealth. To think about wealth as money and other assets which are increasingly or inherently intangible. Okay, let's drill down a little bit further. So the third principle is the principle of knowledge, status, and influence, right? And these assets are all inherently intangible, and they're assets that we want to attain, maintain, and optimize at different points and times in our life, right? So the question then becomes, what are we valuing and why? Why do we find value in status, knowledge, and influence? And so I'll start with knowledge because I think that's foundational within this pairing. Mm-hmm. Knowledge is created when we take in information and we braid it with our experiences and intuition, okay? But gaining knowledge is one thing, and actually using it is a totally different thing. Yeah. The real value of knowledge comes from when you actually use it, and you might set out to gain knowledge for purposes of attaining a job, right? Or attaining information for purposes of raising your kids. Either way, it's the application of the knowledge that really unlocks the value. And this unlock can be for purposes of yourself, right? Or for purposes of others around you. And so speaking of for purposes of others around you, that's where status and influence start to fold in. So you can gain status within your community by virtue of utilizing your knowledge. And that's what you do. I know so much of, particularly, through this podcast, for example, you invite people to come on and to showcase their knowledge that's hopefully of use to other people. That's the whole point, presumably. Yeah. But people can gain status by doing this. And status is innately hierarchical because it holds one person's contributions perhaps above another's. And that sounds a little bit harsh when we think of it that way, but had real practical utility if we think back to the time of hunters and gatherers, where you might have a knowledgeable hunter who successfully provides for the community, thereby attaining higher status, right? Than the non-knowledgeable hunter who isn't able to provide for the community. But these days, of course, people are granting status for different things, right? We're finding value in different things, but the same logic applies. And then finally, in terms of influence, the ability to influence someone's beliefs or behaviors is quite powerful. Yes. So, said differently, influence has the ability to inspire or motivate others. And when people are able to use influence productively, to wield it for productive use, contributing to society in a meaningful way, to the fabric of society, to people's lives, that is so powerful. So that's Absolutely. Why I coupled these 3 intangible assets together in kind of the sequencing of those assets: the knowledge, status, influence.
Well, and I'll give you a very close to home example: writing a book. I mean, why do people write a book? I mean, you were smart and you had a lot of this knowledge before, but in writing a book and putting it together and courageously sharing it with the world, you now have status as an author. And If you want to speak on stages, it helps to have the status of an author. And if you want to have influence, you'll likely get more of those opportunities as you've, codified and put this book together. I hope you're seeing that. I hope it's playing out exactly how you want it to. But I think of, that's one small example of, how people are using status and influence and knowledge for their own gain, but also you have a message that you care enough about that you want to share it, and you've taken your time to put it together and to get it published. And so anyways, kudos to you for investing in yourself and then sharing it with us.
No, well, thank you. And that's a really good example. And it's taking the knowledge that we all carry, because it's all so unique, because it's based upon, again, our experiences, intuition, and information. So your experience, your knowledge, right, that you offer to the world in all the mediums that you do is unique to you. And so you're utilizing that for benefit of others, right, as well as yourself. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's pivot to another form of wealth that you talk about, and that's the relationship between health, quality of life, and wealth. What are some of the proactive ways you're seeing people manage and invest in this particular form of wealth?
Yeah, so the health conversation, actually, I'll tell you a little secret, speaking of writing books. When I first set out to write this book, and I had my principles, and I was like, oh, I really don't want to write the one on health. Like, how boring. And then, as it turns out, it's one of my favorite chapters. But the thing is that the thing with health is that people are redefining health just the same as they're redefining wealth. The old health narrative is such that we're healthy when we're physically fit, although the new health narrative is that we're healthy when we're physically, mentally, and spiritually fit. Mm-hmm. So the concept of health is expanding as well. And we're walking away from the outdated concept of thinking about health by virtue of just like, what's someone's weight? What does their skin look like? What's the brightness of their eyes? I mean, those things matter, but there's different markers of health that are invisible.
The other thing you bring up, and I'll let you get back, but it's not just the lack of illness, it's something more that's proactive. And I love how you kind of dove into that.
Yeah, so I think it's, like many things, we're flipping it on its head. So instead of focusing on the negative, we're focusing on the positive and being preemptive. Mm-hmm. And we're able to be preemptive because, well, the narrative is shifting, right? Societal shifts, but as well as technological advancements are helping us to bring visibility to the invisible markers of health. So I know I talked about in the book, the example of a ring or an Apple Watch, both of which measure your biometric data, which then feeds into the corresponding app that you have on your phone, and you can look at this data whenever you'd like. So we have this information at our fingertips, which is sourced through our fingers and our wrists, which is absolutely wild. So this quantitative data can help us make qualitative changes in our lives. It can help us to make behavioral changes. So that's one way that people are investing in and managing their health. But staying again on the theme of invisibility and going back to the point earlier about expanding the definition of health to include mental and spiritual health as well, I think it's important that society is now celebrating, right, these aspects of health, because health is physical health, yes, but it's also the mental and the spiritual. And the mental and the spiritual both carry on this archetypical essence of invisible, right, intangible, ethereal nature. But what's really powerful is that people are willing to place value on these attributes of health anyways, even though they're incredibly tricky to talk about in certain terms, right? They're really hard to quantify. So nonetheless, we're becoming increasingly interested in attaining, maintaining, and optimizing these aspects of health as well. And in terms of, improving upon these aspects of health, I think it's the tried and true. It's the good night's sleep. It's the healthy food. It's the meditation. It's the exercise. It's the, breathing, sunlight, nature, all of these things, which are readily available to nearly all of us.
Yeah. And the challenge is, I think sometimes we want to pull those things apart and say, well, I'm going to work on this and I'm going to work on my mental health. And you can't just leave some things untended to. It's taking that kind of approach where there's time and energy spent on all of those in some measure. And as you talked about earlier, I think, in different parts of our life, we may overweight our attention or our time to these different, parts and pieces of our wealth. But I think just being awake to what are we doing, what are we not doing, and then like feeling like an agent and not feeling like life is just acting upon us. And well, yes, now I'm sick. Like feeling like you can take control by making some choices, I think is one of the big takeaways. I wanted to ask a follow-up question on health wearables. I feel like the information is helpful to an extent, but I also wonder if it's like looking at your investment portfolio too frequently. As if you check your stocks, multiple times a day, that's going to change how you feel about your investments, where you're saying, well, these are long-term investments, but if you look at them every 3 hours, like that might not actually be healthy. I don't know if you thought about that at all with like these health wearables.
It's a funny point, but a very spot on point. And I think ultimately this comes back to our conversation on knowledge, right? It's one thing to acquire information, it's another thing to act on it. So
Yeah.
ultimately, the utility of the information that we get from wearables, for example, or for looking at your investment portfolio is only as valuable as your ability to productively use this information. So the
Mm-hmm.
real power comes from using this quantitative data to make qualitative changes, thereby improving the quality of your life. And it's funny because I imagine that the type of person who enjoys looking at their Oura ring watch statistics, if you will, is also the kind of person who might look at their portfolio a lot too.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Um, I found the wealth of relationships with self and others particularly fascinating as well. And as a father of 6 children who are all very different, I sometimes feel drawn and quartered in my efforts to invest in them and also have something left to invest in my relationship with my wife and then also taking care of myself. As you think about investing in our relationships with ourselves and others, what are some tactical tips to being more intentional in this area?
Yeah, six
Give me
kids.
the magic bullet, Jennifer.
Okay, fine. No,
Just
but
kidding.
6 children, that is remarkable. And I think it's wonderful, despite it perhaps feeling like a juggling act from time to time. But and it's honestly a miracle you had a chance to read my book, that said. But I think that as for investing in relationship with self and others, I think ultimately it all starts with investing in yourself.
Yeah.
I think that's paramount, and this isn't a novel idea. I mean, we think about the Greek maxim, "Know thyself." That's been around since the beginning of time for a reason, and it represents the philosophy and the idea and the importance of self-knowing. And so I think having an awareness of your beliefs, right, your thoughts, your emotions, um, shines light on the whys of your decisions and your actions, how you orient yourself in the world. And knowing thyself is critically important when you consider that your beliefs, your thoughts, your emotions, decisions, and actions all impact your money, your health, your knowledge, your time, and your relationships. So the investment into self is an unequivocal win. Plus, your relationships are the foundation. Your relationship with self is a foundation on which all other relationships are built. So, as with anything in life, the stronger the foundation, the stronger the build. The question then becomes like, how do you fortify and strengthen the relationship with self to then have strong relationships with others? And here's your silver bullet, Dave. So I think the answer is questions and conversation, right? Intentional questions and conversation. That's the silver bullet, because they provide, they're a tool for self-inquiry, which is powerful. They're also a tool for understanding others. And so this inquiry is available and accessible through questions and conversations. Plus, questions are a great way to get to know other people, but it's a great way to get to know yourself as well. And it's through conversation like this that we're able to give and receive the assets of time, energy, and information to help to build the asset of relationship. So ultimately, the quality of our conversations, I think, builds the quality of our, quality of our conversations build the quality of our relationships. And Dave, you're the master at this. So I imagine you have this buttoned up and
No,
so I
you
wouldn't.
nailed it though. You nailed it though, because I really believe that if well, even our conversation right now, if I'm not curious about you and what you know and what you care about, like there's no conversation here. And it's the same whether you're in your relationship with a spouse or with your children. So I think it starts with, am I genuinely curious about this person? And if I can say yes, then I can engage. And that curiosity shows that I care.
Mhm.
And I think in the world where we are so distracted, if we can take moments where we care enough to be curious about someone else, I think that's the magic of developing a relationship. I mean, you and I have never spent any time with each other. Um, we've seen each other today. I've read and learned from you. We're having an interesting conversation, and I think because we care and we're having a dialogue back and forth, it changes from two people who are strangers to now two people who share some common wisdom and some common, common experience, which I think is fascinating.
I think it's fascinating too. And it's so powerful. And and that's how relationships are built, right? It's one conversation at a time. So
Mhm. So towards the end of the book, you get very practical with what you call your personal wealth algorithm. You talk about the relationship between principles, values, and wealth. Can you expand on these?
yeah, sure, with pleasure. So we talked about the power of knowing thyself, right? And the personal wealth algorithm is a tool to do exactly that as it relates to the concept of wealth, right? So the personal wealth algorithm presents 3 steps that you can use to what I call define your wealth. And it presents 3 steps to help you identify and prioritize that which is most valuable to you at a given point in time in your life. And while I'd like to walk through the algorithm, but given just timing and such, instead I'll share some context about the relationship between principles, values, and wealth, almost like a preface, right, to the personal wealth
Okay.
algorithm. And for anyone who wants to dive into that, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to hop on a call. Um, but at this point in time, so we're all familiar with the idea that we're wealthy when we have an abundance of what we value. That's the new definition, right, that invisible wealth puts forth. The question then becomes, well, what are you valuing and why? And this is a big abstract question, but the 5 principles plus your personal values are the keys to unlocking the answer to that question, because it really comes down to the interplay between the 5 principles plus your personal values. But to truly appreciate this, or to get it, right, to understand this interplay, I'd love for us to do 3 things. So that's 1, just define principles, 2, define values, and then 3, explore how principles and values interplay with each other as it relates to defining your wealth. So first, principles are collective objective truths that are unchanging and permanent. And values are individual subjective truths that are changeable and malleable. So principles are non-debatable, whereas values are debatable. Principles transcend the individual, whereas values are specific to the individual. So with these definitions in mind, we can start to explore the interplay. So the 5 principles of invisible wealth are a set of principles, right? That's our premise. They're collective objective truths as it relates to the word and world of wealth. So when we look at the 5 principles, when we look at each principle, right, each asset, we each agree collectively and objectively that they're all valuable to the human experience, to human flourishing, because every human values money, every human values health, every human values knowledge, every human values time, and every human values relationships. But the way that we interpret the value of these assets is different for each person. Why? Because we each see the value of these 5 principles through the prism of our values. That's a little bit dense. Let me say it again. We each see the value of these 5 principles through the prism of our values. So here's an example to kind of concretize the point. Let's imagine that one of my core values is freedom. right? Let's also assume that one of Prince Harry's core values is freedom. So Prince Harry and I both share the same core value of freedom, right? But we each interpret freedom through our own complex matrix of being. My interpretation of freedom is going to be different than Prince Harry's interpretation of freedom at this point in time in our respective lives, right? My interpretation of freedom might relate to, be pegged to, be tethered to the first principle, money, meaning that I tend to think about freedom in terms of financial freedom.
Yep.
Whereas Prince Harry's interpretation of freedom might relate to, be pegged to, be tethered to the fifth principle of invisible wealth, relationships, meaning that he tends to think about freedom in terms of freedom from the relational unit, his family unit, right? So this example highlights the fact that everyone's values interplay differently with these five principles. Or said differently, everyone's values map onto these principles in a different, unique way. Because ultimately everything is content and context dependent, right? It's not enough for us to say that, well, my core value is freedom. Okay, great. Relative to what, right?
Yep.
So as it relates to what? So that's kind of the preface of what the personal wealth algorithm gets to, and to help the individual to know thyself and to define what their concept of wealth is by identifying and prioritizing which assets are most important at a point in time.
I just have one or two other quick questions and then we'll wrap it up. But in the book, you talk about the importance of culture. A few months ago, I was in Africa, in Uganda, and for the first time ever. And it was very clear to me that I needed to understand culture better so that I could interact in a way that was helpful and meaningful. So a couple months ago, I interviewed Dennis Jaffe about the impact of collective, individualistic, or honor cultures and their influence on family businesses. Can you talk about the importance of the relationship between culture and financial capital?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, so was that interview after your trip, after you got back?
So it was after, but I already had the assignment. So I took the book with me on the trip. And so I was reading it as I'm flying to Africa, and it was very helpful, actually. Very helpful. Yeah.
How's that for perfect timing,
It was
right?
great timing. It was
Yeah.
great timing.
And that's one talk that I really want to listen to. And thank you for highlighting that and also placing it on my radar. I think I've been in my own little whirlpool of ideas and I need to like branch out and see what other brilliant people are saying. But in terms of culture, yeah, the reason I folded that in, I mean, for obvious reasons, but I think it's important to recognize that culture really influences our values. And there's one quote by Jordan Peterson, something to the effect of, cultures are to adults as parents are to children. And I thought that was quite profound and a great framing, because ultimately the values of our ecosystem, wherever we are going to influence ourselves. But again, that goes back to know thyself. It's important to understand who we are, so we're able to parse out like what's my surroundings versus what's me. And perhaps the two are one and the same, but perhaps they're not. So I think the conversation and topic of culture is very much needed and important within kind of family conversations as well.
Yeah. And culture evolves. I mean, that's the beautiful thing too. The culture that we live in evolves. I went from, a father who really didn't believe he could own something. He was a salesperson, and now the context with my own children is teaching them how to own things. And so that's kind of a cultural shift. That's a small, kind of tiny little thing, but culture is a really interesting thing to study for sure.
It is. Yeah.
So we just scratched the surface on the contents of your book. I'm gonna really encourage people to go out and buy it and study it. But I wanted to give you the floor to see if there's any like one principle or something that you feel like is crucial that our listeners that are interacting with us in this conversation. Is there something that we missed, or is there something you'd really like to highlight that you learned as you were writing this book and as you were preparing to share it with the world?
I think that thanks to your questions and thanks to the conversation that you facilitated and gave me the opportunity to step into. I think we've unpacked a lot of ideas together here today, and I think it's a perfect place for us to tie a bow on it. I really, really, really appreciate the opportunity and chat with you.
Jennifer, we appreciate you joining us on Authors at Drucker, and appreciate the investment in putting this knowledge together and packaging it up so that we could easily access it and incorporate it into our world. So appreciate that. I'm gonna share my screen one last time and talk about what's coming. So for our audience today, our next Authors at Drucker will feature Stephen Goldbart, Stacey Allred, and Joan DeFuria about their book, The 10 by 10 Learning Roadmap, Advancing Flourishing in Families of Wealth. Thanks again to all of you for investing your most precious asset, which is your time. And again, Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing this time with us at Authors at Drucker.
Thank you, Dave.
Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.